the past 6 weeks, though, we've been learning a lot about the book of Job. And in a nutshell, if you've missed the past 6 weeks, which is actually okay, the first 2 chapters happen to talk about the setting for Job's testing. This character named Ha-Satan, which is not this red devil with the tail and the horns that we think about now in our culture as we know it. It's an ancient understanding. Ha-Satan really means accuser. And Satan approaches, or Ha-Satan approaches God, questioning the sincerity of Job's righteousness. And God gives permission for Job to then be tested in a series of catastrophic events. Job loses his children. Job loses his servants. Job loses his livestock and therefore his livelihood, and is even afflicted himself with painful sores all over his body. Then come in the 3 friends, right? If you were here for that one. They come to console him, and it all is fine and dandy. They sit with him for 7 days, and then they open their mouths. And that's their downfall, because they eventually rationalize that Job's plight can only be a punishment for personal wrongdoing and an invitation from God to repent. Job, though, being wise, trusting his gut, rejects their explanation, and then begins to challenge God to respond. Job cries out and begs God to give the reason for his suffering as he finds it unjust. And unjust, we know as the reader, it is, because we're told that at the very beginning of the book. Job is one of the most righteous men on all the earth and did not deserve what was about to happen to him, right? Job's question throughout all of the chapters, all 42 of them, if you want to give it a go, is why? Why is there unjust suffering? And I think that's a question that's not just from his day and age. It's also in the 21st century as well. Last week, we heard God's response in chapter 38 and some of through 41, 39, 40, 41. Unfortunately, God did not offer the answer to the question why, which we were all eagerly waiting for, but instead God ends up cataloging the wonders of creation. Job is apparently content, though, with this, and in the epilogue, which is what we were just reading there, the last chapter, 42, the Lord restores Job's fortune by doubling his trouble. Now, I don't know if you think this is a book of wisdom, but according to scholars, it is a book of wisdom. There are 7 books of wisdom, and you're probably familiar with a couple of them, right? The other wisdom books are Psalms, the Songs, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those are all in our canon of Scripture, but in the Apocrypha, there's an extra book, and it's called the Wisdom of Solomon. I'm not sure about you, but I do have a little trouble finding wisdom in this book, at least at first glance. Throughout the study, I have asked what people have thought of this Job series. And some in our congregation have said, oh yeah, I've really enjoyed it because I can relate to Job's longing for answers as to why there's suffering in the world. You know, I mean, we have that solidarity in our walk, the same question, the human question of why. But on the flip side, one person in the congregation doesn't like the book of Job at all and would prefer to tear the pages out completely from our Bible. I'm not going to name any names, but you didn't see me look over that way. Okay. And I almost agree with that. Another shared that though they were happy that God responded to Job, they were nevertheless frustrated that God kind of dodged the answer to Job's question of why bad things happen to good people, right? I mean, God did. God played the, oh, well, who were you at the beginning of time when I was doing all this creation stuff, right? That's not the comforting response we were all hoping to hear. Another was angry with Job's 3 friends, right? While still, another did not like Job's wife. And actually, that was not a man, that was a woman that said that to me, did not like Job's wife and would have written her right out of the text. She didn't say very good things, right? Remember when she said, oh, Job, curse God and die, right? Be careful who you marry. Again, different sermon, different day, but be careful who you marry. Now, I do think in general, there are some bits and pieces of wisdom we can extract. And so I thought, instead of me thinking of all of it, why not have you tell me what you have gleaned from this book? Anybody willing? I mean, I have some stuff I can share, but has anybody picked up anything, wisdom from this book that we can really claim? What about God not necessarily creating havoc or evil, but God allowing it? Now, I don't know how wise that is, but that's just something we can glean from the book. I like to land on how God hears our cries. I think that's a very important piece that, we can go to God with anything and even question God, and that God hears. And another thing is that not only does God hear, but in Job, we get God responding to our cries. So God doesn't just sit up in the heavens and, file his nails and just wait around for us to complain and woe is me and help me this and that, and then forget us and ignore us. God responds. I think something else I can get from this book is that even though Job was faithful, we may not always be faithful, and nevertheless, God does. God remains faithful to us. And another piece is that God is sovereign and that God is just. Now, these are all great takeaways from the book of Job, and if you have other ones, I encourage you to email me or call me, text me, send me some of your thoughts on this. But I cannot reconcile the ending of the book. I appreciate that Job receives this double blessing for his trouble, but I wonder if that math really works. Because, yes, Job was healed of his boils and his own bodily illness, right? And that the property that was destroyed by the whirlwind could eventually, or was maybe at the end, chapter 42, was rebuilt, right? He's having all these family members and friends over for dinner. But honestly, the one that gets me, that I cannot reconcile, and I'm just being honest, is that his children, his servants, and his livestock, all the living things, could never, ever truly be replaced. Right? So that one I have some trouble with. So how can there be wisdom in that, especially if we define wisdom as insight or a good sense of judgment or knowledge that can be applied at the right time? If we go back to chapter 28, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will point out to you, this is really easy, Job 28:28, chapter 28, verse 28. You will discover that the author, whoever wrote this book, whoever wrote this text, has his own slant on wisdom and how to acquire it. In verse 28, we're told that to fear the Lord, and I don't mean to be afraid of God, I mean in the reverency, respectful way, right? To fear the Lord and to shun evil, that, my friends, is true wisdom, claims the author. Only God holds true wisdom. God alone knows where wisdom dwells. Only God, who sees and knows all things, can know the pathway then to true wisdom. Only God, who made all things and intimately knows the created order, can say where it is to be found. Only God, who saw wisdom from the beginning and tested it and approved its ways, can declare it then to humankind. And apart from God, everything is lost. Now, if you go back to the very beginning of our Bible, you get to the book of, anybody know the first book of the Bible? Genesis, yes, it starts with a G and ends with Genesis. Do you remember what the serpent said to the woman in the garden about the fruit of that forbidden tree? You surely shall not die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and knowing evil. Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate that fruit, seeking to be wise apart from their Creator. That is called the fall. the great fall of humankind, and generation after generation has suffered since. And yet, I see good news in this, that God extends God's hand to us, reminding us of what wisdom is. And if you look to that second reading, I'm going to read this from the Message Bible. This is the Proverbs reading, right? Good friend, don't forget all I've taught you. Take to heart my commands. They'll keep you living a long, long time, a long life lived full and well. Don't lose your grip on love and loyalty. Tie them around your neck. Carve them. Carve their initials on your heart. Earn a reputation for living well in God's eyes and the eyes of the people. Trust God from the bottom of your heart. Don't try to figure everything out on your own. Listen for God's voice in everything you do and everywhere you go, because God's the one who will keep you on track. I love this part. Don't assume you know it all. Run to God and run from evil. Well, I think the Apostle Paul got his hands on the same thing, right? He was a master at the Old Testament, the books of law. He wrote a letter to the early Christians in the city of Corinth because they were in the midst of a prideful and fruitless search for the world's wisdom. And he pointed them to the message of the gospel of Jesus, which includes both born in a manger and died on a cross. Right? Very humble things. But he says this, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer, or you could sub in lawyer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach the crucified Christ. To the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than humankind, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. God's wisdom itself is Jesus the Christ. There's your answer. There's your answer. God's wisdom itself is Jesus the Christ. And there will be moments in our lives when we ask the question why, probably now and forever. I mean, who knows? We might get to heaven and still not get the answers we want. And you know what? We're just going to have to be okay with that, whether we want to or not. And though we not always get the answer to the why when we experience trials and tribulations, I can promise you this, really truly, that we can trust in the God who hears our cry, the God who responds in our crying, the sovereign and just God who remains faithful, and God who is wisdom itself in the person of Jesus. So this day, as we wrap up our Jobian understanding and sermon series, I say this: all thanks and glory and honor and power be to the immortal, the invisible, God only wise.